Imagine being invited to your own brother's wedding, only to be seated in the kitchen with the staff, treated like an outsider in your own family. That was the breaking point for Terry, the forgotten daughter who had quietly built a multi-million-dollar tech empire after years of being overlooked. But instead of staying silent, she made one phone call that changed everything, canceling a $10 million contract and exposing the truth behind her family's lies. What started as humiliation turned into empowerment, and the girl they ignored walked out stronger than ever. If you've ever chosen self-respect over toxic family expectations, share your story or country name in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories about finding your voice. They seated me in the kitchen, next to the clang of dishes and the smell of overworked ovens, a place reserved for staff and leftovers. The sound of champagne corks popping, and the swell of orchestral music drifted in faintly from the ballroom beyond the swinging doors. My name wasn't on the chart, my seat wasn't at the family table, and in that humiliating moment, every buried memory of being invisible in my own home came rushing back. The wedding was supposed to be a celebration, but for me, it felt like a replay of a lifetime of being treated as less than. I stared at the lone chair by the ice machine, the silverware wrapped in paper instead of cloth, and thought, this was their final message to me. Sit quietly, stay out of sight, and be useful only when asked. But my story doesn't begin there. It begins long before, in a modest Illinois home where I learned that love in my family came with conditions. I was the firstborn, the one who was supposed to set the standard, and from the start, my parents decided my value lay in meeting expectations they never intended to celebrate. My brother, Kyle, was the golden boy. 4 years younger, destined in my father's eyes to inherit the family business, praised for average achievements while my triumphs were treated like chores done correctly. I remember the glow in my father's eyes when Kyle scored a touchdown at a high school game. That same evening, I came home with scholarship letters from 3 colleges, and no one mentioned them at dinner. My mother asked me to help Kyle with homework, then wash the dishes. That was the pattern. No matter what I achieved, it was swallowed whole by the myth of Kyle's importance. I grew up in the shadows of his mediocrity being turned into greatness. Straight A's, state-level competitions, building a small web design business as a teenager. None of it mattered. They weren't impressed when I built something from scratch. They were impressed when Kyle remembered to take the trash out without being reminded. When I was 16, I won a business competition, holding a trophy that gleamed under the gym lights. I came home glowing, and my father muttered something about wasting energy on hobbies, while my mother told me to keep my voice down because Kyle had a big game the next morning. That night, I sat on my bed, the trophy still in my lap, and realized that no matter what I did, I would never be seen. By 18, I couldn't take it anymore. Graduation was supposed to be a proud day, but my mother's words still sting in my ears. You'll be back when you fail. Family is all you have. I packed my bags the next morning with only $800 in my account and the kind of determination that comes from years of being told you're not enough. I didn't cry when I left. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Chicago became my battlefield, a city where no one knew me, and no one cared who my brother was. My first apartment was a shoebox with peeling paint and a radiator that hissed more than it heated. I worked 3 jobs while taking night classes, often surviving on packets of ramen, falling asleep with textbooks under my cheek. Some nights I felt like I wouldn't make it, that maybe my mother was right. But there was a strange freedom in that struggle. For once, I wasn't being compared to anyone. I was failing or succeeding on my own terms. The calls home dwindled quickly. Birthdays, holidays, the occasional, "How are you?" from my mother, those were the only moments of contact. And even then, the conversations were laced with judgment. When will you settle down? Do you really want to live like this? I kept my distance because every word with them dragged me back into that suffocating house where Kyle's shadow still loomed. For 15 years, I didn't return. I built walls as tall as skyscrapers around the wounds they left behind, pouring all my energy into building something they could never take away from me. I built a company from scratch. Something real, something mine. Yet, no matter how far I ran, there was always a part of me that longed for recognition. It's embarrassing to admit, but even in the glow of success, I wondered if my parents would ever see me for who I had become. Would they ever call and say they were proud? Or was I forever destined to be nothing more than the daughter who left? That longing, buried deep, is why I opened the envelope when it arrived. A wedding invitation, gold embossed, my brother's name gleaming on the front. Kyle, the golden child, was finally getting married. And for the first time in 15 years, my family wanted me back in the same room. At first, I thought maybe this was a chance. Maybe time had softened them. Maybe all the miles, all the years, all the silence could melt away with one family gathering. I told myself it was worth trying, worth risking the pain. What I didn't know then was that this invitation wasn't about healing wounds or rebuilding connections. It was about appearances. It was about leverage. It was about using me, the forgotten daughter turned successful woman, as a pawn in a game I hadn't even realized was being played. Still, I said yes. I booked a flight, told myself to hope, and packed my best dress. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But when the usher looked down at the guest list and couldn't find my name, when he finally guided me to the kitchen, when I stood there staring at the insult disguised as a chair, I realized nothing had changed. In their eyes, I was still the one who didn't belong at the table. And what none of them knew, not my parents, not my brother, not the bride with her flawless smile, was that this time, I wasn't going to stay quiet. This time, I wasn't the girl who left with $800. I was the woman who could bring down empires. Tell me, have you ever been pushed so far by your own family that you finally snapped? Drop a comment below if you know that feeling. Hit like, subscribe, because this is the story of how being seated in the kitchen at my brother's wedding became the moment I walked out and took their future with me. Chicago was not kind in the beginning. The city has a way of testing people, stripping them down to their core to see if they can survive. For me, survival looked like juggling shifts at a coffee shop, late-night cleaning in an office building, and weekend cashier work at a tiny bookstore. Each paycheck was divided into rent, tuition, and just enough left over to keep the lights on. I remember nights when I counted quarters to decide whether I could afford the bus fare or if I'd have to walk home in the cold. The radiator hissed in protest, and the smell of ramen noodles became the perfume of my early 20s. There were moments I almost called home, moments when loneliness wrapped around me so tightly it hurt. But then I'd remember my mother's voice, "You'll be back when you fail." Every setback became fuel to prove her wrong. What I lacked in comfort, I made up for in ambition. I threw myself into night classes, learning code and business fundamentals while the city slept. I wasn't the smartest in the room, but I was always the last one to leave, scribbling notes, asking questions, refusing to let fatigue win. By sheer persistence, I landed an internship at a tiny startup that rented space above a pizza joint. There were only 6 of us, working from folding tables, drinking more coffee than water, and surviving on hope. I loved it. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who cared about ideas, not bloodlines or appearances. The work was brutal, the hours endless, but something in me sparked. I saw patterns in supply chains, little inefficiencies that no one else seemed to notice. While others focused on flashy apps, I was fascinated by the unglamorous backbone of business, how products moved, how data connected, how waste could be cut. The more I thought about it, the more I realized there was a gap, a need no one was filling. I began sketching ideas in notebooks, crude diagrams of systems that could make life easier for small and mid-sized businesses. At first, it was just curiosity. Then it became obsession. The leap to starting my own company came quietly. 2 friends from the startup, people just as tired, just as hungry as me, agreed to join. We pooled savings, took out loans, and rented a shared office barely larger than a closet. That was the birth of Terry Solutions. The early days were chaos. We coded through the night, pitched to investors by day, and answered customer support. Emails from our phones while eating dollar slice pizza. There were weeks we didn't know if we'd make payroll. Some months, I skipped my own rent to keep the lights on for the company. But slowly, piece by piece, the vision took shape. Year 3 was the breaking point. Either we folded or we found momentum. That was when our cloud-based inventory system launched. I'll never forget the first client who told me our software saved her business from closing. She ran a chain of hardware stores and had been drowning in stock errors. Our system cut waste, saved time, and gave her the clarity she needed. Word spread. Referrals came. By year 5, we had 20 employees and a modest but steady client base. By year 7, we had our breakthrough. Major retailers started calling us, not the other way around. Suddenly, we weren't the scrappy unknown. We were the rising star. In 10 years, Terry Solutions had grown into something I could barely recognize from those ramen-stained beginnings. 200 employees, 3 offices, clients in 14 countries, and a company valuation north of $200 million. I had my face on the cover of Business Weekly with the headline, "The Quiet Visionary Behind Supply Chain Innovation." People called me a leader, an innovator, a success story. And yet there was one group that never used those words: my family. Kyle never left home. He went to the local state college, dropped out after 2 years, and nestled himself safely into the comfort of our parents' small manufacturing company. He never had to worry about bills or rent. He never had to sleep in a freezing apartment or stretch $20 across a week. For Kyle, the family business was waiting, a golden inheritance handed to him without question. From the little I gathered during our rare phone calls, their company had stagnated. The world was changing, competitors were modernizing, and they were still using outdated equipment. But none of that mattered to them. Kyle was still the future in their eyes. The contrast was sharp. I had clawed my way from nothing into an empire, built with sleepless nights and relentless drive. He had coasted, cushioned by parents who mistook coddling for support. And yet, if you asked my mother, she would still say, "Kyle is carrying on the family legacy." If you asked my father, he would still beam about the son who never left, while brushing off my global expansion as that computer thing. Still, I tried not to care. I told myself that their opinion no longer mattered. But if that were true, why did I feel a hollow ache every time I hung up the phone after a shallow holiday call? Why did I linger on their silence whenever another article about me made headlines? Part of me, buried deep, still wanted them to see me, not as a daughter to be compared, not as a backup plan when Kyle stumbled, but as someone worthy on her own. That longing, that unresolved wound, is what made me pause when the wedding invitation arrived. The envelope was heavy, the cardstock thick, the letters embossed in gold, Kyle Wilson and Vanessa James. The James name sparked recognition immediately. James Tech Industries. A mid-sized company in industrial machinery, one I had heard about because they supplied components to some of my clients. It was clear this wasn't just about love. It was about status. When I called to congratulate him, Kyle's voice trembled with a mixture of joy and something else. Desperation. "It would mean a lot if you came," he said, as though the words carried weight beyond family. Later, my mother called, urging me to attend. Not for reconciliation, not for love, but for appearances. "The James family is very prominent," she said pointedly. "It would be nice to have our whole family present." And there it was, the truth. I wasn't invited as a daughter or a sister. I was invited as an asset, a successful image to parade in front of business partners. I considered refusing. I thought about tearing the invitation in half and pretending it never arrived. But something in me, a mix of curiosity, pride, and that old ache for approval, stopped me. Maybe it was foolish hope. Maybe it was ego. Or maybe it was the quiet voice that whispered, "If you go, you'll finally see the truth." And so I booked the flight. I told myself I was strong enough now, strong enough to face the ghosts of the past. Little did I know that stepping into that wedding wouldn't heal old wounds. It would rip them open in front of everyone. And this time, I wasn't the forgotten daughter who would sit quietly in the kitchen. This time, I had power. The envelope lay on my desk for days before I opened it again, its gold-embossed letters gleaming like a dare. I told myself I was too busy, that board meetings and product deadlines demanded my attention. The truth was simpler. I wasn't sure if I could stomach what was inside. When I finally slid my finger under the seal, the card was as extravagant as I expected. Vanessa James and Kyle Wilson, in bold lettering, announcing their grand union. My brother's name side by side with the daughter of Harold James, owner of James Tech Industries. The entire design screamed money, status, and performance. It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement. I called Kyle out of courtesy, not obligation. His voice carried an odd mixture of excitement and unease, like a man clinging to something he wasn't sure he could keep. "Thanks, Terry. It really means a lot. Mom and Dad can't wait to see you too." I almost laughed at that. Mom and Dad hadn't lifted a finger to see me in 15 years, and now suddenly they couldn't wait? Still, something in his voice, almost a plea, caught me off guard. For the first time, I wondered if there was more at stake than just a wedding. A week later, my phone lit up with my mother's number. She rarely called. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed. "Terry, you really should attend. Family belongs together at moments like this." I wanted to ask where that philosophy was during my graduations, my awards, the day my company hit its first million in revenue. But I bit my tongue. Then she slipped. Just slightly. "The James family is very respected. It would look good to have all of us there." There it was. The truth. Appearances, not love. I told her I was considering it, though in my chest the decision was already forming. I would go. Not because they wanted me to, but because some hidden part of me still wanted to know, was reconciliation possible? Or had I only been summoned as a prop in a transaction? The rehearsal dinner answered that question before the wedding ever could. The James family had reserved the country club, the kind with chandeliers big enough to swallow a car, and servers who moved silently like shadows. My first impression of Vanessa was exactly as I expected. Perfect hair, perfect smile, eyes that scanned me like a jeweler evaluating a counterfeit gem. She leaned in with an air kiss that never touched my skin. "So, you're Kyle's mysterious sister. We were starting to think you might be a myth." Her laugh was polished but hollow. I smiled politely. "Business keeps me busy." She tilted her head in mock sympathy. "Oh, I know all about busy women. My mother serves on 3 charity boards." The comparison stung, not because I needed her approval, but because she wanted me to feel small. Dinner was theater. Harold. James held court at the center of the table, booming about expansion and growth, tossing out numbers like confetti. Every story ended with him as the hero, every statistic a medal pinned to his chest. At one point, he turned to my father, his voice too loud, too pointed. "So, Robert, how many employees do you have these days?" My father shifted, cleared his throat. 15. Harold's laugh filled the room. 15? We just crossed 200. The table chuckled politely, but I caught the flicker of humiliation in my father's eyes. My mother smiled tightly as though holding a mask in place. Something unspoken hung in the air. Glances between my parents and Harold. Subtle nods. A language of desperation and dominance I hadn't yet translated. It was later, when I excused myself and passed the ladies' room, that I stumbled upon the missing piece. Vanessa stood with her mother, voices low but sharp enough to carry. "She's nothing like I expected," Vanessa said. "From the way Kyle described his big-shot sister, I thought she'd be more impressive." Her mother's reply was smooth, practiced. Appearances can be deceiving. Harold looked into her company. Successful enough, but nowhere near James Tech's league. Still, the connection might be useful. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Useful. That was all I was to them. Not a sister, not a daughter, just leverage. I slipped away before they noticed me, my heart pounding not with hurt, but with clarity. The following day, I met Lisa, an old high school friend, for coffee. She had stayed in town, now working as an accountant. She smiled warmly, but her eyes carried hesitation. "I can't believe you're here. Everyone's talking about it." I raised an eyebrow. "Talking about what?" She hesitated, then leaned in. "Your family's company. It's been in trouble for years. They've lost clients, their equipment's outdated, they're barely keeping the lights on. Honestly, people are saying Kyle's wedding. It's more business deal than romance." I stared at her, cold dread sliding down my spine. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "Harold James has money. Your parents need it. And, well, your presence makes the whole thing look stronger, like the Wilson family has power beyond what's on paper." That night in my hotel room, I pulled up public records. What I found confirmed every whisper. Tax extensions, liens, plummeting credit, ratings. My parents' business was a sinking ship, and Kyle's marriage was the lifeboat. Only it wasn't a rescue. It was a merger. And I was a pawn in the game. The final piece clicked when I saw James Tech's name on a short list of vendors for a massive contract with Vertex Corp., one of my biggest clients. A $10 million deal. A deal I had influence over. Suddenly, everything made sense. My invitation wasn't about love. It was about access. They didn't want me back. They wanted my leverage. The realization stung, but it also sharpened me. If this was the game they wanted to play, I would let them. I would smile. I would sit through their rehearsed pleasantries. I would even endure their little humiliations. But when the moment came, when they revealed just how far they were willing to use me, I would be ready. I looked at my reflection in the hotel mirror, the city lights spilling across my face. For 15 years, I had built myself into something real, something undeniable. And tomorrow, when the spotlight turned to me, they would finally see that the forgotten daughter was no longer someone to be ignored. She was someone who could turn the entire table upside down. And they wouldn't. See it coming. The morning of the wedding felt like walking into a storm I could already smell, but not yet see. My hotel room was filled with sunlight, soft golden beams filtering through white curtains. But my chest was heavy. I chose my outfit carefully. A deep blue designer dress that spoke of success without screaming for attention. I wanted presence, not spectacle. My reflection in the mirror looked composed, polished, untouchable. But beneath the surface, the girl who had once left home with only $800 still trembled. As the car pulled up to the church, my stomach tightened. White roses lined the entryway, gold ribbons swayed in the breeze, and photographers buzzed around capturing every angle. It was less a wedding and more a display. A business pageant staged under the guise of love. Inside, chandeliers glistened overhead, and the scent of expensive flowers coated the air. The usher asked my name, brows furrowed as he checked the call list. His pause stretched too long. "You're not on the main family list," he said finally. "But don't worry, I'll check the extended section." Extended section. The words burned. Seconds later, I was led to a seat near the back, tucked behind distant cousins I barely remembered. My parents' friends, people who once called me promising, sat closer to the altar than I did. The ceremony itself was a performance. Vanessa glided down the aisle in a gown that glittered like it was stitched with ice. Kyle looked pale, nervous, eyes darting not toward his bride but toward Harold James, seated proudly in the front row like a king at court. The vows were cold, rehearsed, sprinkled with phrases like partnership and shared future that sounded more like a merger agreement than a love story. Applause rang out, photographs flashed, but I couldn't shake the pit in my stomach. This wasn't union, it was transaction. Afterward, the reception moved to the Grand Hotel ballroom. Guests streamed in, their laughter loud, their champagne glasses clinking like currency. I made my way to the seating chart, expecting something, anything, that would acknowledge my place as sister of the groom. A staff member intercepted me instead. "Miss Wilson, if you'll follow me, please." Her tone was polite, but her eyes avoided mine. We wove through table after table of elegantly set places, past crystal glasses and white linens, until she pushed open a side door. The smell of garlic, steam, and sweat hit me. Stainless steel counters stretched out, and in the corner, a small table set for one. A single chair, a single plate, tucked beside an ice machine humming too loud. "This can't be right," I whispered, my face flushed hot, my throat tightening. "These are my instructions," the woman replied softly. "If you'd like to discuss it, you can speak with the bride or groom." For a moment, I stood frozen. 15 years of absence, of clawing my way up from nothing. And here I was, seated in the kitchen. My humiliation was not subtle. It was deliberate. I saw it clearly. They hadn't just forgotten me. They wanted to remind me of my place. But what they didn't know was that this time, I wasn't powerless. I walked back into the ballroom, every step steady despite the fire inside me. My eyes locked on the head table. Kyle, pale and quiet. Vanessa smiling with sharpness. Harold radiating smug power. My parents sitting stiff, eyes downcast. I approached and spoke low, not wanting to create a scene. "There seems to be a mistake about my seat." Vanessa looked up with a cold smile that barely touched her lips. "No mistake. We had limited family seating. Important business associates needed to be accommodated." My gaze swept the table, noting the empty chairs. The gaps were there, was clearly room. "There seems to be space," I said evenly. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father fiddled with his silverware. Silence was their shield, as it had always been. Vanessa's voice rose just enough for nearby tables to hear. "She doesn't run anything here. Let her eat with the staff." The words sliced through me, sharp and deliberate. For a heartbeat, the room hushed. I caught Kyle's eyes, saw the flicker of shame, but he said nothing. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. Harold leaned forward, his voice low, conspiratorial. "Perhaps after dinner, we could discuss that Vertex Corp contract. Kyle mentioned you have influence there, family helping family, right?" The final mask slipped away. This was it. The entire performance laid bare. I wasn't here as a sister. I wasn't here as a daughter. I was here as leverage. A strange calm washed over me. My anger cooled into precision, like a blade honed to strike. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and dialed without hesitation. "What are you doing?" my mother hissed, fear finally cracking her voice. "Marcus," I said clearly, my eyes never leaving Vanessa's face. "Pause the vendor selection process for James Tech Industries on the Vertex Corp contract." Mark them as ineligible for values. Misalignment. Yes. Effective immediately. I ended the call. Harold's face turned crimson. Vanessa's lips parted in shock, her composure shattering for the first time. My mother clutched at her pearls. My father sat frozen. Kyle's fork hovered in the air, suspended in disbelief. "You can't do that," Harold sputtered. "I just did," I replied, voice steady, almost calm. "And before you think about retaliation, know that I've already documented the emails. Kyle, your birth date plus baseball is still your password. You should really take better care of your security, especially when plotting to use your sister without her consent." Gasps rippled around the table. Vanessa's practiced smile collapsed into fury. My parents stayed silent, their cowardice louder than words. I smoothed my dress, stood tall, and said clearly, "Congratulations on your wedding. I hope you find exactly the happiness you deserve." Then I turned, walked through the ballroom, and left. Eyes followed me, whispers erupted. But I didn't falter. A server passed by with champagne. She recognized me, whispered that she too had been mistreated by my parents when she worked for them. Without thinking, I invited her to leave with me, to tell me about her skills, to join me for dinner instead. She slipped off her apron, and together, we walked out of the grand hotel into the cool night air. Behind me, the head table burned in chaos. Ahead of me, the night opened wide. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing approval. I was claiming my power. The night air outside the hotel felt cleaner than it had in years. For a moment, I just breathed, letting the adrenaline drain from my chest as Sarah walked beside me. The sounds of chaos inside the ballroom, raised voices, hurried footsteps, the clinking of glasses, faded into background noise. I didn't know where we were going, only that I wasn't going back. My phone buzzed in my purse, again and again. Kyle's name flashed, then my father's, then my mother's. I silenced each one without hesitation. Sarah looked at me, nervous, but grateful. And when I asked if she wanted to have dinner, her smile told me I'd made the right call. At Antonio's, the little Italian restaurant where I'd celebrated victories in high school, the owner recognized me instantly. He hugged me, proud of what I'd built, and sat us at his best table. Between sips of red wine and plates of pasta, Sarah told me her story. 6 years at my parents' company, loyal and hardworking, until she asked for maternity leave. "Your father told me I should be grateful I even had a job," she said quietly. "They fired me 2 weeks before my due date." I clenched my jaw, fury simmering, not just at their cruelty, but at the familiarity of it. They had always treated people like tools, family, employees, even their own daughter. By the time I dropped Sarah off at her apartment, I had already offered her a position at the Chicago satellite office we were opening. She was stunned, speechless for a moment, before whispering that it would change her life. As I drove away, I felt lighter. For once, I wasn't just protecting myself. I was rewriting the pattern, turning pain into something constructive. But the relief didn't last. My phone buzzed again in the parking lot of my hotel. This time, I didn't ignore it. Kyle was waiting, leaning against our parents' car, his face pale, his suit jacket unbuttoned like he'd just run a marathon. 15 missed calls, he snapped as I approached. "Could you not answer one?" His voice cracked with desperation. I met his gaze coldly. I had nothing to say. "You humiliated us," he said, voice rising. "Do you know what you've done?" "Yes," I answered. "I stopped being used. Something I should have done years ago." His shoulders slumped, anger dissolving into despair. "This isn't just about you, Terry. Dad's company is drowning. That contract was everything. The marriage. It was our last chance." His words hit me like confirmation of everything I already knew. So it was never about love, I said softly. It was about a bailout. He looked away, ashamed. I do care about Vanessa, but yes, the timing, the deal, it all mattered. Harold made it clear your presence would seal the contract. You were part of the plan. I laughed bitterly. And when the plan called for humiliating me in the kitchen, you said nothing. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His silence was louder than any excuse. That was Vanessa's idea, he whispered. I didn't know until it was too late. I shook my head. But you stayed quiet. You always do. We stood in the parking lot, the night heavy between us. Is there any way you'll reconsider? He asked finally, almost pleading. The contract, the deal, it could still save the company. For the first time, I looked at him not as my brother, but as a man trapped by the same family that had once trapped me. I almost pitied him. Almost. No, Kyle. What happens now is not my responsibility. It never was. His face crumpled. What about family loyalty? Loyalty goes both ways, I said firmly. When was the last time any of you showed it to me? He had no answer. The next morning, I boarded a flight back to Chicago, moving my return up by 2 days. I needed distance, not explanations. My assistant, Marcus, was waiting in my office with updates. The Vertex contract has been reassigned to Alvarez Manufacturing, he reported. Terms are better, actually. James Tech has no grounds for retaliation, though they're trying. I nodded. A small part of me feared reputational fallout, but another part knew the truth. My record spoke louder than gossip. Still, the emotional weight lingered. Days later, an email from Kyle arrived in my inbox. Short, raw, and painfully honest. The wedding is postponed. Vanessa left. Dad is meeting with bankruptcy lawyers. Mom won't speak to anyone. I don't blame you. I blame myself for not standing up sooner. I'm thinking of moving away, starting fresh. If you're willing to talk, I'd appreciate your advice. I read it twice, feeling no satisfaction, only a strange mix of sorrow and relief. The cycle was breaking, for him and for me. I didn't respond immediately. Some wounds needed silence before words could heal. A week later, another letter arrived, this one handwritten on my father's business stationery, an apology. My parents admitted their failures, acknowledged their cruelty, and said they didn't expect forgiveness. For the first time in 34 years, I saw humility in their words. Whether it was genuine or just desperation, I couldn't yet tell. I placed the letter in my desk drawer, not ready to forgive, but not willing to throw it away. Meanwhile, Sarah officially joined Terry Solutions. Her new salary was double what my parents had ever paid her, and her gratitude was humbling. Watching her thrive reminded me that legacies aren't built from family names. They're built from choices. Choices like who you lift up, who you give a seat at the table. Still, the scars inside me ached. So I took another step I had avoided for years. I began therapy. Week by week, I unraveled the knots of conditional love and impossible standards that had shaped my identity. I learned that standing up for myself wasn't betrayal. It was survival. I learned that family could be chosen. And I learned that sometimes the only way to heal was to stop waiting for validation that would never come. By the time months had passed, my parents' company was gone. Kyle had moved to Denver, and Sarah had become a vital part of my team. The old family structure had collapsed, and in its place, something new, tentative, imperfect, but honest, was beginning. The night of the wedding was no longer a wound. It was a turning point. And though the fallout had been brutal, it was also the moment I finally realized that freedom doesn't come from being seated at someone else's table. It comes from building your own. 1 year later, I stood in my hometown again. not as the forgotten daughter returning in shame, but as the CEO of a company breaking ground on a new manufacturing facility. The irony wasn't lost on me. The land I purchased had once belonged, to James Tech, the same company Harold James bragged about at that country club dinner. Now it bore the banner of Terry Solutions, and the press called it a hometown success story. For the first time, my presence here wasn't about appearances for someone else. It was about creating something real. Jobs, growth, opportunity. The mob ribbon cutting was surreal. Local officials lined up with smiles, reporters clicked cameras, and employees, many of them once laid off by my parents' company or James Tech, cheered as the giant scissors sliced through the red ribbon. Among the crowd, I spotted familiar faces. My parents, older now, humbled by bankruptcy and early retirement. My father no longer spoke with arrogance, and my mother's eyes no longer judged. They observed, quieter, softer. Kyle was there too, flown in from Denver, his girlfriend Jessica at his side. He carried himself differently now, not as the golden child propped up by others, but as a man who had earned his place in a new industry, building a career on renewable energy. For the first time, I felt proud of him. In my speech, I did something unexpected. I acknowledged my parents. They taught me the value of hard work, I said to the crowd, letting the words hang without bitterness. It was a generous interpretation, but it gave us all dignity. Privately, we knew the full truth. Publicly, it allowed healing to move forward without reopening every scar. My father's eyes glistened as he nodded, and my mother pressed her lips together, as if holding back tears. But my work wasn't just about facilities and products anymore. Therapy had opened something inside me, and I realized that my life couldn't only be measured in revenue or contracts. It had to be about impact. That's why I created the Wilson Foundation, a scholarship fund and mentorship program for young women from small towns who wanted to pursue careers in business and technology. Girls like me, who were told they'd never be enough, now had someone standing in their corner. The first batch of scholarship recipients sent me handwritten letters, thanking me for the chance to dream bigger. Reading those letters late at night, I cried in a way I never had when my own parents ignored my achievements. I cried because their voices mattered to me, the way mine never had to my family. Speaking engagements followed, conferences, leadership summits, business panels. At first, I resisted, not wanting to relive the past in public, but when I finally shared parts of my story, not the sordid details of the wedding humiliation, but the broader truth of being overlooked and building anyway, the response was overwhelming. Women lined up afterward to tell me they had lived the same pain. Some spoke of brothers treated as heirs while they were invisible, others of parents who never acknowledged their worth. My story wasn't just mine. It was theirs too. Somewhere in that journey, I found space for love. Jackson entered my life quietly, a widowed architect with steady hands and a steady heart. He understood the weight of loss, the grind of building, the ache of resilience. With him, I didn't have to perform. I could be tired, vulnerable, human. 6 months after the ribbon cutting, he proposed with a simple ring and a simple question. "Will you let me share your table?" And for the first time, I said yes without fear. 2 years after the wedding that never was, I hosted a dinner in my Chicago penthouse. Around my table sat people who represented every chapter of my journey. My parents, Kyle and Jessica, Sarah and her daughter, Jackson, and close friends who had become chosen family. The air was warm with laughter, the clink of glasses, the hum of conversation. My mother complimented the meal I'd cooked herself, and my father discussed architecture with Jackson without a trace of competition. Kyle joked about his upcoming wedding in the Colorado mountains. "No assigned seating this time," he said, catching my eye. Everyone sits where they want. We all laughed, the tension breaking like a final thread snapping free. After dinner, my father raised his glass. His voice, usually gruff, trembled. "To Terry," he said, "who stood up when none of us did, who showed more grace than we deserved." For the first time, their acknowledgement felt sincere, not transactional. Tears stung my eyes. But they were not the tears of the forgotten daughter. They were the tears of a woman who had finally been seen. Not because I had begged for it, but because I had stopped needing it. Later that night, on the balcony overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline, Kyle asked me, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just gone along with it all, sat in the kitchen, signed the contract, played your part?" I thought about it, then shook my head. It would have looked like harmony, but it wouldn't have been real. And eventually, the resentment would have destroyed me. He nodded, his voice soft. "When you stood up that day, it was like breaking a spell. You showed me the truth. Better late than never." Inside, laughter rose again, the sound of a family reshaped by honesty. For the first time in my life, the table I sat at was mine. Not granted out of pity, not tolerated for appearances, but earned by truth. And so I leave you with this. Sometimes family loyalty means breaking patterns, not repeating them. Sometimes love looks like setting boundaries so you can finally breathe. And sometimes the best thing you can do is walk out of the kitchen, even if it means burning a bridge, because freedom is worth more than approval. Have you ever had to choose between family expectations and your own self-respect? Share your story in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves a seat at the table. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your voice when others try to silence it. Because remember this, you don't belong in the kitchen. You belong at the table. Thanks for watching.